All right, welcome to the 2021 Grawemeyer Religion Award lecture. This year's Grawemeyer Religion Award recipient, Stephen J. Patterson, this evening will present You Are the Children of God, Christianity's First Creed. His lecture is based on his 2021 Grawemeyer Award-winning book, The Forgotten Creed, Christianity's Original Struggle Against Bigotry, Slavery, and Sexism. That book is published by Oxford University Press in 2018. To begin our evening's event, we'll begin things with Louisville Seminary's president, Reverend Dr. Alton B. Pollard III.
Good evening, and welcome to Louisville Seminary's Grawemeyer Lecture in Religion. Since 1990, Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville have recognized influencers from around the world who offer rich insights into the relationship between human beings and the divine, and the ways this relationship may empower human beings to attain wholeness, integrity, or meaning. Charles Grawemeyer was a person of remarkable vision who deeply believed that great ideas should be understandable to someone with general knowledge and not the private treasure of academics. It is in this same spirit that Mr. Grawemeyer established the award in religion, as well as awards in music composition, ideas improving world order, education, and psychology. These awards serve as his mechanism for encouraging world-shaping achievement by encouraging great ideas. The ideas that our Grawemeyer Religion Award winners share challenge us to take a deeper look into what we as people of God believe to be true about ourselves and the world in which we live. It is through that challenge that we find affirmation, or at the very least, cause for further examination. And so it is with tremendous care and respect that Grawemeyer Award winners are considered and selected. Tonight, we will hear from someone who is certainly worthy to be included among those who have been recognized, a group that includes Ibo Patel, James Cone, Diana Eck, and other renowned thinkers. Won't you join me for a moment of prayer? God of the margins, who also resides at our center. God of the oppressed, who sets every captive free. God of our weary years, in a world sore divided, you who live in the interstices of our lives, at the intersections of our fear and greed. To you, O God, we lift our hearts this evening in prayerful preparation for this year's Grawemeyer Lecture and Award winner. Hear, O God, the contents of our hearts, and be gentle with us as we learn how to be better human beings, one with another. Amen. I would like to now invite Dr. Tyler Mayfield, Louisville Seminary's A.B. Rhodes Associate Professor of Old Testament and Faculty Director of the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, at this time to introduce you to our 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Religion winner.
Good evening, and let me add my welcome to you. Thank you for attending our virtual special event tonight. via Zoom and Facebook. After taking the year off and not selecting an award winner for 2020, we are delighted to be here tonight to celebrate our 2021 winner. You are invited tonight to participate by asking questions to our lecturer about our topic. After our lecture tonight, there will be a time of question and answer. If you would like to ask a brief question, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. We are unfortunately not able to take questions from those who are watching via Facebook. Tonight we honor Dr. Stephen Patterson, the George H. Atkinson Professor of Religious and Ethical Studies at Willamette University, for ideas in his 2018 book, The Forgotten Creed, Christianity's Original Struggle Against Bigotry, Slavery, and Sexism. He completed graduate studies at Harvard, Claremont, and Heidelberg, and taught for more than 20 years at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis before moving to Willamette University in 2010. He was a leading figure in the Jesus Seminar for more than a decade and has appeared on numerous documentaries, talk shows, and videos. In 9 books and more than 75 articles, essays, and reviews, Dr. Patterson has explored the origins of Christianity, especially those texts and traditions outside of the biblical canon, and those hidden histories and traditions that have been lost along the way, especially the lost Gospels, Q, and the Gospel of Thomas. Patterson's big idea in The Forgotten Creed centers on a statement from the origins of Christianity before Paul and the writers of the Gospels. It is not a traditional credo statement about God or Christ, but one about human identity. It is early Christianity's first creed, long forgotten, but nestled still within Paul's letter to the Galatians. And it claims that we are all God's children, a remarkable assertion of human solidarity. This creed imagined a world in opposition to the Roman Empire's caste system, a world in which baptism brought about solidarity. Patterson's work is truly worthy of the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, and we are delighted to have our winner with us tonight virtually. His lecture this evening is entitled, "You Are the Children of God, the Story of Christianity's First Creed." Dr. Patterson, on behalf of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville, I present you, albeit virtually here, with the 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. We welcome you tonight and we look forward to your lecture. Congratulations.
Thank you, Dr. Mayfield. Thank you so much. And I will just take the medal, which I'm wearing tonight, and lift it up a little bit so you can see it. It's just been presented virtually, but so I'm very, very grateful for the award. And thank you for that introduction. I want to thank the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville for this award and for honoring Charles Grawemeyer and his way of thinking about the world. I'm very, very honored to be a part of this. I'd like to thank Tyler also for all of your work, and I know that it must involve quite a number of reading lots and lots of books and doing lots and lots of research to come up with a winner every year. So thank you for that. I want to thank also the Reverend Dr. Pollard, President of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, for your words this evening and for hosting this event. And of course, Dr. Bendapudi of the University of Louisville as well. Thank you all. I'm truly grateful and honored to receive this award, and I hope that you enjoy these remarks tonight. So I believe now I can share screen in just a moment, and I'll begin. Okay. All right, I trust you can all see the screen now. Give me a thumbs up. All right. Well, as Dr. Mayfield said, what I'm going to talk to you tonight is the book that I've written called The Forgotten Creed. I think I have a picture of it here somewhere. Yes, there it is. And it is about this little ancient Christian creed, maybe not even Christian, maybe pre-Christian, stuffed into one of Paul's letters. It appears in this text from Galatians, the epistle to the Galatians, namely, as you can see, 3:23 through 28. Trying to get it to light up here for you. There you are. These are this is the part of the letter, the little passage in question that scholars have looked at for many years, probably since certainly since the middle of the last century, and thought, well, here's something special. Notice in verse 28 that repetitive dyadic structure, no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no male and female. Many people said, here is an early Christian creed. 27 mentions baptism, and so lots of people have said this is probably a baptismal creed. So these are all things that I say or I agree with, and so the Forgotten Creed isn't really forgotten by scholars, but it just never has really played much of a role in Christian theology and Christian ecclesiology. So that's why I'm lifting it up. Paul, when he adapts things, he adapts them. This is not something that Paul himself composed. And when he takes pieces of tradition, puts them into his letters, he usually alters them, leaves his fingerprints on them. And so many people have tried to reconstruct the creed. Dennis MacDonald, a few years ago, in a wonderful book, There Is No Male and Female, one of his early books, he reconstructed it this way, with good arguments. But ultimately, I decided he was probably wrong about that. And I reconstruct the creed more along these lines, following more or less Hans-Dieter Betz in his commentary on the epistle to the Galatians. Let me pull it out here for you so you can see it a little bit better. That's more or less how the creed originally went, as far as I can see. We could go into more detail if you wish about why this and why that, but that's generally it. And most would agree, at least on this much, that the heart of the creed, the heart of this thing, is these three dyadic statements in the middle of it. There is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free, there is no male and female. What's remarkable about these things is that these are really the three ways by which human beings at just about every time and every place have constructed for themselves various caste systems to elevate some and denigrate others. There is no Jew or Greek. That is a particular version of the ethnicity question, or race, if you will. You can imagine that any number of ways in the ancient world. There is no Greek or barbarian. There is no Roman or Gaul. Lots of ways you can imagine this, but just about everybody said it. There is no slave or free. That is the basic class distinction in Greco-Roman antiquity. Roman law is formulated around the basic distinction between slave and free persons. And then finally, of course, everyone can see this is, there is no male and female. This is the gender distinction in antiquity as in modernity. So race, class, and gender, the creed is about that, basically. Many have pointed out also that this creed is formulated probably on the basis of an ancient cliche, of which there are several versions, a handful of versions. This is the one I include in the book that I think is the most salient. This is from Diogenes Laertius, a Hellenistic writer who's writing about Thales and Socrates many, many years before them. Hermippus in his Lives refers to Thales, the story which is told by some of Socrates, namely that he used to say there are 3 blessings for which he was grateful to fortune. First, that I was born a human being and not one of the brutes. That's the slave-free distinction, by the way. That I was born a man and not a woman. Thirdly, a Greek and not a barbarian. Again, there are various versions of this, but this is the voice of the free-born, native-born man declaring his liberty, his freedom, his power, his privilege, his fortune, over against which women, foreigners, and slaves exist by rank below him. The creed that we're talking about is built as a kind of what should we say, reverse order of this ancient cliche. It stands it on its head. It makes fun of it. It declares against it. I don't know how one might say that best, but there is no Jew or Greek. There is ethnicity in antiquity, again, slave or free, class, male and female, gender. Before going on, I want to just call attention finally to the way the creed ends. For you are all one. It's important to underscore here that it says you are all one, not that you are all the same, as if to discount all difference or to discount diversity. I don't think that's the point. If you pull out Jew or Greek by itself, say as Daniel Boyarin did several years ago, one might think about that as problematic insofar as it erases Jew in the face of Greek, or erases Jew in the face of Christian history, and that certainly is true. It's a problem. But in the context of the creed, where you have no slave or free, no male and female, I think that the meaning of the thing is this: you are all one. Oneness does not signal sameness, it signals solidarity. And so I think that the creed is basically a statement of human solidarity in the face of caste systems, Roman, Greek, or American, as far as that's concerned. So a little thesis to begin with here. The creed in Galatians 3:26 and 28 was not about negating difference, but building solidarity across the lines of race, class, and gender, the distinctions upon which ancients constructed their elaborate caste system. So I would argue that the Forgotten Creed expressed the first impulse of the Jesus movement to create a community beyond caste. And the first question is perhaps, what happened? What happened to this creed? What happened to its sentiment? What happened to its commitment? Did it last? And the answer to that is, well, I think vague familiarity with history will tell you that it didn't really last. And in fact, some of these issues are just coming back to us now in the 21st century. So what happened? In large measure, the book that I've written is about this. It's about, what happened. What were these commitments about in early Christianity, and how did they finally come to disappear? First of all, there is no Jew or Greek. I want to underscore how committed at least the Apostle Paul was to this proposition in the creed. As I said before, most people think that Paul did not himself compose the creed, but this is the part of the creed that Paul was really interested in. This is why he cited it in Galatians, because this is the argument he's trying to make in that letter. I'm calling attention to Galatians 2:11 through 14, though, because this is kind of a famous account in Galatians that scholars refer to fondly as the Antioch affair. And this is a little confrontation that happened at Antioch in about the latter part of the 30s, say around 38, 39, 40, somewhere in there. And Paul had been working in around Antioch for some years by then. He'd made at least one journey to Jerusalem to consult with Peter and other leaders in Jerusalem. And he thought he had an understanding, probably a misunderstanding, but he thought he had an understanding that it was all right for him and his colleagues, to form communities, especially in Antioch, that were mixed Jewish and Gentile, Jewish and Greek specifically. And the backdrop of that was a history of recent, fairly intense violence between Greeks and Jews in Antioch in that period, right about the time Paul was working in around Antioch. And so his decision to create common meals in which Jews and Greeks would sit together was, well, it had wide-ranging implications, let us say. Its significance was far beyond what I think many Christian theologians thought it was, namely that Paul had decided that the law was no more, that we could move beyond the law. I don't think that's his idea at all. I think that his idea is that Jews and Greeks who would like to kill each other should rather sit together and eat. Paul was willing to lay down everything for this principle. And you can see this in the epistle to the Galatians. You see it also in Romans. Years ago, Christopher Stendhal, a wonderful Pauline scholar from mid-20th century, wrote a book called Paul Among Jews and Gentiles, in which he argued that Paul's basic insight, that his basic idea of justification by faith was formulated not to answer the question, how might I, miserable sinner though I am, might be saved, but how it is that Greeks or Gentiles can join in the Jesus movement without having to be circumcised. All of his arguments about the law, I would say, are more or less about that. So Paul was deeply, deeply committed to this. Of course, not everybody was. Paul says that when Peter came to Antioch, he was with them at first. I said to Peter, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, how can you compel Gentiles to live like Jews? He's saying this to Peter because Peter, when the other folks from James came, whom he calls the circumcision party, when they came and arrived, said, no, you can't do this anymore, Peter withdrew from table fellowship. So Paul was all in on this, but other parts of the Jesus movement were not. And this is a major factor in Paul's various conflicts with other parts of the Jesus movement all through his life and career. What happened to it? Well, basically what happened to it, ironically, is that Paul's efforts to recruit Gentiles into the Jesus movement were rather successful. And within, say, 60, 70 years, it is certainly likely, possible anyway, that there were more Gentiles in the Jesus movement than there were Jews. One of those was the author of the Gospel of Luke and the other volume of that 2-volume set, the Acts of the Apostles. And at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, Luke creates a scene where Paul has come to Rome, and he's there kind of under house arrest, and people are coming to him, and he's teaching them. And in the final chapter, he gets into a little bit of a lecture, if you will, and he says this to Jews who are present. He says, the Holy Spirit was right in saying to your ancestors, to the prophet Isaiah, go to this people and say, you will indeed listen, but never understand. And then he continues quoting that prophetic saying, out of context, of course, but saying that the Jews did not listen, did not receive Jesus as they should have. And then he concludes the speech with this statement, let it be known to you then that this salvation has been sent to the Gentiles. They will listen. And so as the Jesus movement became the Gentile church, if you will, it gradually turned its back on its Jewish roots. And that's a story that is all too well known to everyone listening tonight, I'm sure. But here you see the beginnings of it, this kind of supersessionist theology that says Jesus came to the Jews did not receive him, and therefore he went to the Gentiles. We're taken to the Gentiles, and we Gentiles have received him gladly. And so the very idea that Christian churches would comprise both Jews and Gentiles after that was more or less moot. There is no slave or free. This was, it's a little hard to tell how committed the Jesus movement, earliest Christians, nascent Christians were committed to this. Enslavement of poor and especially foreigners in the Roman Empire was extremely common. The Roman economy was a slave economy. And so slavery was kind of the third rail of political and social discourse. People generally didn't challenge it, didn't question it. And so it's hard to know exactly how nascent Christians felt about it. Jesus doesn't say anything about slavery. And when Paul says something about slavery, he usually says it in such a way that at least offers plausible deniability. He doesn't completely dissemble, but he's not as clear as when he's talking about Jews and Greeks and the necessity of having communities that are mixed communities. He'll go to the mat for that, but on the issue of slave or free, he's not so clear. And it may simply be because this topic made him nervous, as it did everybody. But he says in this passage something remarkable. This is kind of a famous passage. It's been much disputed all through the 19th century, of course, in antebellum America. It was interpreted, reinterpreted. But at the end of this passage, he says this: "You were bought with a price, do not become slaves of human masters." And after mumbling around for 2 or 3 lines, this probably does express Paul's opinion about it. I wish he had been more clear. To get clearer statements, you have to wander quite far. There are other texts that show that earliest Christianity was interested in freeing slaves, and sometimes in the perspective of slaves. One of the best known books, maybe the most popular book in Christianity, in Christian circles in the 2nd century, was a book called Shepherd of Hermas, written ostensibly by a foundling, that is someone who began life as an abandoned child and was found and raised by slavers. He was raised in slavery, later freed, so he was a freed person, we say. But that entire work is written from the perspective of a freed person, of someone who had experienced slavery. And it makes a big difference. It really does. I encourage you to look it up and take a look at it. The first time you encounter slavery, and you encounter Christianity in the broader Roman Empire is in the 2nd century, in a letter written by the Roman governor of Pontus Bithynia, kind of a famous letter by Pliny the Elder. And he says he's found this group and he doesn't understand them. He doesn't really know very much about them, but they won't make the sacrifices. And so he's upset. He captures 2 of their leaders and tortures them for information, discovers they're not doing anything terribly wrong. But what is interesting to me is how he describes them. They are female slaves. The leaders of this community were female slaves, which is just about the bottom of the various layers of intersectionality in the ancient world. What happened to this commitment to at least thinking critically about slavery? Again, I turn to a text of the early 2nd century, which, by the way, is where I would put the Acts of the Apostles, early 2nd century. And I think 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are texts to be dated around that time as well. If you're not well versed in biblical scholarship, you might be surprised that I'm turning to another letter of Paul's first letter to Timothy. But most scholars agree that 1st, 2nd, First and Second Timothy and Titus weren't actually written by Paul. They were written by someone imitating Paul, pseudepigraphically, we say, in the early 2nd century. That is, they're writing in Paul's name. And unfortunately, when the imitator addresses some of the issues that were centered to Paul's concerns, he handles them quite differently. And slavery is one of those concerns. Paul may have mumbled around a little bit about it, but he finally came clean and said, do not become slaves of human masters. The author of 1 Timothy was a little bit more conventional, a lot more conventional in his view of slavery. Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor. And that's just one of the handful of statements he makes about slavery in other parts of the letter and elsewhere in that little corpus of letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Earlier letters imitating Paul from the Deutero-Pauline corpus also make statements like this about slavery. So it seems that a good many people in the Jesus movement ran from this issue as fast as they could, maybe as far as they could. And so the issue of slavery went unchecked and unchallenged in the great empires that would follow under the flag of slavery for many hundreds of years, and not really questioned until after the Enlightenment, when other forces came into play to challenge the legitimacy of slavery. Now this seems inconceivable to us, that for all those centuries, the church could sanction this basic caste distinction, the cruelest of all, but it did. Finally, there is no male and female. This is a very interesting statement in the Creed, and Dennis MacDonald treated it sort of separately all by itself and argued that there was probably a baptismal tradition that was related just to this part alone. And I think he's right about that. And it had to do with the peculiar wording of this clause imitates rather precisely and a little peculiarly the Greek version of Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, where the text speaks about the creation of the first human being, male and female. God created him. And so there was probably a baptismal tradition that built just on this idea. The thought of baptism as initiating people into a new kind of status that recaptured that character of Adam before he ate the forbidden fruit. And one of the most interesting and to our ears probably peculiar aspects of that idea, that cluster of ideas, was the idea that Adam at this point and at this time, it was the primordial human being, was neither male nor female, but both male and female, because that's what the text says, of course. God created him male and female. He was an androgyne. And so Christians did indeed experiment with this idea and various ideas about how to recapture that primordial non-gendered existence before the creation of both male and female. They did this in various ways, ritually, in terms of lifestyle. One of my favorite texts from early Christianity is the Acts of Paul and Thecla, featuring Thecla, who is a kind of wandering apostle in her own right, who wants to imitate Paul, but finds that as a woman, she cannot do it without getting into a lot of trouble. And so finally, she cuts her hair short, dons male clothing, and begins to present herself as a man. And that's how she functions as an apostle. I don't think that is the meaning of the creed, though. I don't think that this clause in the creed is talking about primordial androgyny or something like that. Together with these other two clauses, neither Jew or Greek, neither slave or free, it's really talking about, again, those distinctions that ancients made upon which they based their caste system. The salient feature here then, male and female, is the power differentiation. The difference between male privilege and female privilege. And if there was quite a lot of talk, I guess, about how women had come up in terms of status and power in the later part of the Roman Republic, and that is true. But by the Augustan era, that was all over, in my estimation anyway. And so we shouldn't soft pedal this. In the Roman Empire, men had all the rights, women had virtually none. So this is somewhat of a remarkable statement. We go back to Paul again, Romans, the epistle to the Romans, to kind of illustrate this. And again, if you're not well versed in New Testament scholarship, you might think, why is he going to Paul? Paul is isn't Paul the misogynist in chief among early Christian writers? And actually, that's really not true at all. We get that impression from the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and in part from the Deuteropauline epistles, none of which were written by the Apostle Paul himself. In a very famous passage in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, counsels for women to keep silent in all the churches, but that also is regarded by many scholars. I don't know if you could say most scholars, nobody's taken a vote, but certainly many scholars believe that's a late insertion into the text, probably by the same person who wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Paul himself has a much more nuanced position. On the one hand, from 1 Corinthians, we know that 1 Corinthians 11 in particular, we know that he had a kind of conventional sensibility about men and women, and he thought that women should look like women and men should look like men. And in that particular passage in 1 Corinthians 11, he's dealing with a situation where probably men and women are praying and prophesying in kind of holy ecstasy and comporting themselves, dressing in a way, having their hair in a certain way so that they look androgynous perhaps, or maybe they look unique, so you can't tell who the men are, who the women are. At any rate, it's an unusual enactment of liturgical androgyny, if you will. And Paul, in addressing it, says, don't do that. Nobody does that. We're not doing that. None of the other churches do that, which is, okay. I've always thought that was a little unfortunate. But Paul himself, from reading his letters, it's become clearer and clearer, especially from pioneering historians like Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza and others, that Paul's churches, Paul's world, Paul's Jesus movement, if you will, was featured many women as leaders. And one of the most important sources for understanding that is this chapter in Romans, thought by many to have been originally a separate letter, or maybe a cover letter for the whole of Romans, doesn't really matter, but it's a letter of recommendation for a woman named Phoebe, whom he describes as the diakonos, or the minister of the church in Cenchrea. That is, she's the leader of that church. And he also goes on to say that she is the patron of many and even of me. So to understand what he's saying, we have to remember that patronage was a big part of ancient life, and to be the patron of someone was to really have a lot of power and control over them, and to be the client of someone was to have certain obligations, even legal obligations. So Paul's relationship to Phoebe is a subordinate one. In fact, he works for her. I think I call this section of the book Paul's boss, Phoebe. I may be overstating it, but well, you get the point. Furthermore, though, in the rest of Romans 16, as he's going through the letter, mostly what he does in this letter, this little letter of recommendation, is name check people. He's mentioning people who presumably are in the community to which the letter is written, and he's name checking them to impress people who are listening to the letter, so that he can tell them, he can signal to them that he knows all the important people that they know. And about half of all those important people that they both know in that letter are women. So this is an important piece of evidence for what most scholars, I think, realize about Pauline Christianity. that at that stage, at that point in the development of the nascent church, women played important leadership roles throughout the communities. Women, I meant to show you this earlier. I do apologize. I commend you, Phoebe, the minister of the Church of Kenkrea. This is how he starts that letter. Now, back to the 2nd century and the imitator of Paul, who writes 1 Timothy. I don't want to say that in the 2nd century, all women's leadership in the church ended, because it didn't. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are one half of an argument that seems to have been raging in the 2nd century about the role of women in the church. And not just the role of women in the church, but the role of the feminine in talking about the divine. So there's a kind of a parallel theological discussion going along here, asking whether or not God is truly all masculine, or if there are feminine aspects of God as well. I just guided a group of undergraduate students today through one of Elaine Pagel's wonderful essays in the Gnostic Gospels, all about this today, and they were truly fascinated, I can tell you. But within the pages of the Bible, we have mostly the side of the argument that was interested in shutting down the role of women in leadership roles. This is, in this particular letter, the pastor, who now posing as as Paul, who is regulating behavior in these churches. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Excuse me, I mistyped that. She will be saved through childbearing. That last remark in this passage is particularly stinging, because in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is talking about men and women who want to enter into sort of full-time devotion to the church, it's clear that there are men and women who are engaged in celibacy and asceticism. He clearly says there that women who wish to engage in celibacy and asceticism should do so. That's the preferred mode of life for them, as well as for men, he says. He even names them in that chapter. He calls them the widows, the kera. And many people have speculated that that's kind of an early kind of office for women within the church. Later in this letter, 1 Timothy, the author of the text specifically shuts down the office of the kera, of the widows, and defunds them, in fact. So what happened to the creed? Well, you can see what happened, I guess. On the one hand, maybe this first creed was a little bit too unbelievable, too unconventional, too out there for normal people who began to join the Jesus movement and eventually the church in greater and greater numbers. They did not expect themselves to be joining a kind of radical movement. As whole households became part of the church, they brought with them a household way of related to one another, a pattern of life that had been in place for centuries and not easily displaced. And so to redefine roles for women, for slaves, to redefine the relationship between native born and foreign born was perhaps just a bridge too far for most people. But another thing happened too, and I want to try to say this as carefully as possible. This creed was probably associated with baptism. And I've come to think over the years that baptism was not initially the rite of initiation of people into the church. At the point of Paul's ministry, when Paul was in Corinth, for example, he speaks about baptism not as the rite of initiation that everybody went through, but a kind of a rite that some people would go through and others didn't. And So, but at some point that changed, and baptism did become a rite of initiation, probably maybe within Paul's lifetime already. And that really changes what the function of baptism really. As a rite of initiation, it functions to create a boundary between those who are inside and those who are outside. And as such, it really is set up not to challenge lines of caste, but to support and, what should we say, establish lines of caste. Initially, of course, people were joining this movement and becoming part of this movement to experiment with radical new ideas, to celebrate. There is no male and female. There is no slave or free. This was a new thing. They were celebrating a new thing. But with time, the new thing became an old thing and a more conventional thing. And by the time you reach the Middle Ages, baptism is a kind of initiation rite that you have to go through to be part of society, to be a functioning member of society. And that will be important. And in a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about caste in America and the role that baptism has played in creating a sense of caste in America. But anyway, as a rite of initiation, it becomes something else. It becomes a kind of marker of insider outsider status, and therefore well suited to caste-based systems of organizing life and human relationships. Finally, and I've just been alluding to this, the church itself became an expression of caste. If you were inside the church, you had a certain status. If you were outside the church, you had another status, a lesser status. This could have consequences in the days of the Holy Roman Empire, in the days of the great Catholic and Protestant princedoms. This had great significance. I think, for example, in the 15th century on the Iberian Peninsula, just as Columbus was getting set to sail for new shores, it was acceptable for Christians to enslave Muslims, but not to enslave Christians. You could enslave unbaptized people. You could not enslave people who had been baptized. And this was the idea that early colonists brought to the Americas. And this idea that baptism represented a kind of barrier between those who were real people and those who were lesser, those whom you could, you had to treat as full human beings, and those whom you could enslave. Baptism was the key. This brings me to maybe the last thing I really want to talk about this evening, and that is how the work that I'm doing on this creed and the thinking that we're all doing about it, it relates to the thinking that we're doing now about our own lives and the role that caste plays in American life. I've been moved recently, of course, by Isabel Wilkerson's book by this name, caste. I think she's incredibly insightful in naming the realities that we all live with. But I want to repeat what I said a moment ago, that we must remember that the first marker of caste in the Americas was not color. It was religion. It was baptism. And it only became a matter of color when baptism proved to be too malleable as a boundary marking the free from the enslaved. Soon, of course, slaves both indigenous Americans who were being enslaved and African Americans, Africans who were being kidnapped and enslaved in the Americas, they saw this and began to seek out baptism as a route to freedom. Only then did slavers switch to color as a more reliable and durable and impermeable boundary to mark the American caste system. But those who held slaves in the Americas didn't switch their religion. They didn't cease being Christian, and they didn't stop reflecting on the relationship between their faith and what they were doing. And so religion continued to play a decisive role in the American caste system as inventive ways of reading scripture, for example, to justify the enslaving of Black people. The idea, for example, that when Cain killed Abel and God put a mark on him, the mark that God put on Cain was that he was Black. He made him Black. That was the mark of Cain. Or the idea that when Noah's son Ham looked upon his nakedness and Noah cursed him to slavery. They invented the idea that Ham, of all the sons of Noah, was Black. So religion continued to play a role in caste in America. African Americans, slaves, and then their descendants became Christians, of course, and baptized for themselves, created communities, and their baptism into that place of refuge and dignity and equality that was the Black church meant that baptism meant something quite different from what it meant in white churches. That sense of belonging in either community had a much different significance. So baptism has played a role in our understanding of caste. We can't ignore that. So that's why I'm doing this work. This is why I'm going to loop back around to our creed and remind us all that this was originally a baptismal creed. This was arguably Christianity's first creed. Before we began to think about the nature of God or the nature of Christ or how a person is saved, all those things that become the subject of our creedal statements, we had this, that you were all children of God. You were not, there is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free, there is no male and female, for you are all one. This remarkable statement of solidarity. As progressive Christians take up these questions again today about questions about racism, questions about class, questions about gender, I think it's just helpful to know that these are not new issues for people who are Christian believers. These were issues for the church right from the get-go. This is not something that people are worried about now just to be hip or cool or in tune with the times. This has been something that's been on the minds of the followers of Jesus for centuries, even from the very beginning. So history can function this way, and that's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to call our attention to this history. We don't forget it. Just to remember, this first creed was all about solidarity. It was not about separation. It was not about joining an exclusive community. It was about forming lines of solidarity across lines of race, class, and gender. And perhaps this first creed, this ancient of all creeds, is calling us all to be something new, calling the church to be something new in this time and place. Thank you very much. That's all I have for you tonight. And I would like to I'll pass this back to our web host in a moment here. So let me stop sharing. Let's see. Chris Wooten, right?
Yes, sir.
And I'll pass it to you. You will now be the host. Make host. All right.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank-
Before you begin, Chris, let me just interject here. You'll see on the board quite a number of Stephen Pattersons in the Zoom, on the Zoom board. And that is because I unwittingly shared my special link. I didn't know it was my special link with a number of colleagues both here and around the country. So it's fun to see them there. I see Charles Bovitz there staring at me behind his picture. And so I apologize for sharing that link. I shouldn't have, but there they are. That's why there are so many Steve Pattersons on the board.
It's quite all right. Thank you, Dr. Patterson. We'll spend the next few moments taking questions from any of our attendees this evening. You may submit questions in the Q&A box below or the chat box. And without further ado, Dr. Patterson, we have a first question for you. What is your reason or evidence for your contention that the earliest Christians did not all practice baptism as a rite of initiation?
Good question. Thank you for that, whoever posed it. It's a little bit of, I don't blame you for being a little slack-jawed at that. But if you read the opening chapters of 1 Corinthians, you'll see something very peculiar. And that is Paul says, now remember, Paul was the person who ostensibly founded the Corinthian community, right? He says there in those opening chapters that he did not baptize anybody in Corinth. And then he remembers, oh, I did baptize a few people, Stephanus and his household, Gaius and Crispus. He stumbles around a little bit and names a handful of people that he did baptize. But after he gets flustered and remembering these names, he says, but I'm not a baptizer. I didn't come to baptize, he says. I'm not a baptizer. I came to preach the word. And so Paul doesn't understand himself as primarily as a baptizer. And it's clear that he did not baptize the members of that community when they formed a community. He baptized a few people. What that meant, I don't know, but you actually can tease it out a little bit. The baptizer in that community, when Paul was writing 1 Corinthians, was probably Apollos. Apollos, another early Christian leader who had visited Corinth, and he's kind of the main target for Paul's frustrations in 1 Corinthians. And in Acts, we learn, interestingly, that Apollos, the only other place where Apollos is mentioned, we learn that he was a follower of John the Baptist. And so I think this is a pretty plausible scenario that baptism first came into the Jesus movement through followers of John the Baptist who became followers of Jesus, who joined up with the Jesus movement, like Apollos. And people who didn't come that route, like Paul, didn't really know about baptism, weren't really exposed to it, and encountered it first through people like Apollos. And it probably had some special significance for Apollos. It may have had to do with that Genesis narrative. It may have had to do with something about immortality, something like that. It certainly had to do with imparting the Spirit. And that was a significant thing. And that becomes a significant thing for baptism all along. So that's why I argue it. And, there are a few people who have heard that argument and agree with it. A lot more probably who hear it and say, nah, Paul doesn't really mean that. In 1 Corinthians, he's speaking loosely or figuratively or something. But I do think that it's true. Thanks for the question, though. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up question from the same person. Doesn't 1 Corinthians 12:13 work against that contention? Here, Paul equates being baptized into one body with the taking down of boundaries. So it supports your theory about the first creed, correct? If not, why not? I'm worried that you're reading the latter function of baptism as a marker of division back into early Christianity.
Oh, yeah, no, well, let me just address the worry, okay? No, I don't think that, I think that the baptism was not a marker of division, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here, that it wasn't initially an initiation rite, that comes along later, and I'm not really sure when you can peg that time. It's a little hard to grasp, certainly before Acts. But the point I'm trying to make is quite the opposite, that at this early period, certainly in Paul's day, baptism was not a dividing, a ritual that was intended to divide people, but to transform people into new kinds of people that would be neither male nor female, that would be neither slave nor free, that would be neither Jew or Greek.
All right. The next question, what is the reference for the first creed? Where can I find it?
It's in Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 through 28. And as you saw in my reconstruction of it, verse 27, I think, is added by Paul. I think that's his commentary on the creed. Dennis MacDonald thought that the creed actually began there. It comprised 27 and 28. I actually think it comprises 26 and 28, and that's more along the lines of Hans-Dieter Betz's argument in his commentary in Galatians. But generally, you'll find it there in verses 26 through 28 in the 3rd chapter of Galatians.
All righty. Next question. Some consider Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 the earliest pre-literary creed, correct?
Yeah. So I'm saying this is the first creed, but there are lots of contenders, as you can well imagine, and that is one. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 is another, of course. And so these are all pre-Pauline formulae, and that because they're pre-Pauline, people have said here is the first creed or a very early creed. And so, if you were to pin me down on this, all I could really say is that this creed in Galatians 3, 26 and 28 is among the earliest creeds. It's arguably the earliest creed. It's in there with the rest of them. But here's the thing, everybody knows about the creedal commitment to the death and resurrection of Jesus, for example, as you find in those other statements, right? And I think it's worth holding this creed up and saying, look, they were thinking about other things too, and very early on, and very different kinds of things. And you could say that this baptismal creed, insofar as neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male or female, it's just as hard to believe as anything, that Paul is saying about the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's just a different kind of difficulty and a different kind of, what should we say, different kind of problem. And so I just think it's worth holding it up. And one way of calling attention to it is just saying, here's the first creed, here's the earliest creed. But I understand that I'm on thin ice on that. We don't know what the first creed was, but this is a contender. Let's just say that.
Excellent. The next question. I'm asking a question from your own book. You ask, what if radical distinctions do not, should not, cannot exist? What if that unwavering statement shaped Christian ethics and consciousness? Or was the Stoic position always inevitable? Is it now? What are your thoughts on this question? Do you imagine Stoic Christianity and its alternative will perpetually exist side by side?
Mm-hmm. Now, the Stoic Christianity, I should just really quickly unpack that. The idea that the world is as it is, and you're not going to change it. So these big dreams of radical change and difference, and that's just going to make you unhappy. And so there There's other things to worry about, salvation, for example. So, well, I hope that more and more people, I hope that we're all committed to trying to find a way to live and construct a world in which caste systems based on race, based on class, based on gender can become a thing of the past. If you get me on a good day, an optimistic day, of course I believe in that. Of course I'm committed to that. Of course I'm working for that. There's nothing more important that we could devote ourselves to, I think. If you get me on a bad day, I'm gonna open a beer and say, nah, it's never gonna happen. And this is the place we live, right? We live between hope and despair, always trying to lean into hope. And this little book is my way of leaning into hope and saying, yeah, it's possible. The evidence wouldn't confirm it. There's not a whole lot out there to suggest that societies that don't have caste systems are possible. It's hard to imagine. But let me say one more thing about that. And this is what Isabel Wilkerson says. There are caste systems, and then there are caste systems. And the United States has had a pretty brutal and firm and caste system for a long time. So there's no excuse for that. There's no excuse for our caste system and the way we've used it over the years and the way we continue to use it. And so we may not be able to imagine a world without caste, but we can certainly try to imagine a world that doesn't have the kind of caste system and the commitment to a caste system that we have here in America. She finds few parallels. She has to go to South Africa before reform, and she has to go to Nazi Germany, which learned most of its tricks on caste from us, from Jim Crow America. So, we may not ever get it perfect, but we can do a lot better than we've done in the last 400 years.
All right, the next question. Don't we have better understanding of our own faith if we have a solid knowledge and understanding of our Jewish heritage?
Certainly so. Certainly so. It's usually the missing part of our understanding of our faith. I had the one thing, I teach all kinds of courses here, and I teach a course on world religions, and I had 1 day, 1 hour to present Christianity, as I had presented Buddhism and Judaism and other religions in that course, and I had an hour to explain Christianity. And I usually give them a big thing to think about at the very beginning. I call it the big fish. And this big fish was the first generation of Christians were all Jews. By the third generation, most of them were Greeks. And so I think most of what people think about Christianity today is drawn from Greek philosophy. It's certainly the basic idea. We have bodies and souls, and if you're good, your body dies, your soul goes to heaven. That's from Greek philosophy. That didn't come from the Old Testament. It didn't come from the New Testament, really. But there are things about our faith that are truly rooted in Judaism, in Jewish culture more broadly, and certainly the commitment to egalitarian ideals that you find in the Jesus movement and in Paul draws on that very strong prophetic element in the Jewish religion, in ancient Judaism, of measuring the worth and value and success of a society by its commitment to the poor. How do the poor fare is the question. And that's not to say that Jewish life and culture and religion were perfect and ideal all the time either. One of the things I try to do in the book is sort of trace this idea of there is neither Jew nor Greek through Jewish history. And sometimes ancient Jews were very defended and separatist. and sometimes they were remarkably open and engaged and engaging. Tremendous traditions of hospitality. Anyway, it's a big question. I better cut it. I better stop there. Otherwise, we'll just go on forever. I'm so sorry.
That's quite all right. We're good on time. Maybe to build on that a little bit, a question has, I'd like to hear more about the concept of solidarity, especially in this time of polarization.
Yeah. By solidarity, I mean being able to imagine the other person's interest as your own. A person who society, our social structures would say is different from you, is on the other side from you. It ought to be your enemy. Solidarity means being able to see and understand the world from their point of view and have your sympathies be their sympathies, your understandings, not your understandings be their understandings, but that you know that their understanding has a certain kind of validity. And we need this in our culture in so many ways and in so many crossings. Class divide in America is the great unspoken reality, I think, and James Baldwin said that unless we figure that out first, we would never really figure out our white people's race problem. I think, and what he meant by that was that America has always used race to tell struggling whites that you're not really struggling. You're not Black. And that means you're on this side of the line. You're one of us. You may not be rich as Rockefeller, but you're not Black. And so you're free. And you have all kinds of potential. Well, that way of handling class has been poisonous to us for centuries and generations, and it still poisons us. It is what is poisoning us right now. And so the divisions of race and class and gender all demand this kind of attention from us. We have to feel some kind of solidarity. We have to develop some kind of solidarity that will span these divisions. Otherwise, James Baldwin said, we will never be a great nation. We will never be a great people. And he's right. We haven't dealt with our original sin.
All righty. How would you characterize the Lord's Prayer? Is it Old Testament and later rabbinical?
Well, the Lord's Prayer is, the original Lord's Prayer was pretty simple. And one of the things I do is I work on early Christian Gospels, and particularly Q. And the Q version of the Lord's Prayer is very, very simple. It simply asks for daily bread, and this utopian ideal that they're talking about, the kingdom of God might come. It's a very, very simple prayer, and it's free form. I don't see it relating to anything really. It's just something that Jesus made up. When you look at Jesus, you have to remember, I think you have to remember that he's a rustic preacher. He's a rustic teacher. And we might say he's a rabbi, and he is, because he's a Jewish teacher. That's what a Jewish teacher is a rabbi. But he doesn't sound like the rabbis in the Talmud. He's not talking about Jewish tradition so much, unless he's arguing with Pharisees. And that I understand to be later imaginings of gospel writers trying to help them answer questions about their own struggles with the Pharisees, for example. But Jesus himself is a very simple, rustic teacher. And he was making up his own teaching. He was making up his own things. And some of them are common and some of them are quite striking. The one that's most striking to me in relation to this creed is is love your enemies. I think this creed is really a reaction to an attempt to develop that basic insight. It's not enough to love your neighbors, not enough to love your friends. You have to find the wherewithal to love your enemies as well. And then we can talk about solidarity.
All right, the next question. Was baptism a ritual of returning to the covenant, which was broken at Mount Sinai with the golden calf, or is the baptism into joining Christianity?
Well, I wish I had more choices. I don't think that either of those was originally what baptism was about. Baptism is, it's a pretty common thing in antiquity. Every religious tradition uses it, and it's ritual washing so you can enter into a sacred place is basically what it is. But Christians somehow got their hands on the baptism of John the Baptist. And he was called John the Baptist, which means he was doing something special. You wouldn't call just anybody who was engaged in ritual washing the Baptist because it's just too common. So he's doing something special. And I have written a couple of idiosyncratic things on this recently, so I don't want to wade too far into this. You'll just think it's too unusual. I have some novel ideas about what baptism likely meant and where it likely came from. But I do think that it came originally from John the Baptist, and that John's baptism wasn't simply about repentance. It was perhaps a little bit more like, maybe like the baptism you encounter at Qumran, which was a ritual that was preparing them and maintaining them in readiness for some great struggle to come. And it may have been a ritual by which people thought they became sons of God. That's what the Holy Spirit says when Jesus is baptized by John anyway, right? He becomes the Son of God. And that means, ready to do battle. And that's what Jesus does. He heads off into the wilderness to battle demons. And it proves to make him impervious to his enemies. So baptism may have had significance to it that we have not really imagined yet. We just think of it as joining, repenting, cleaning the slate, joining the church, becoming a better person, and availing yourself of the grace of Jesus Christ and those things. But it may be that baptism was a lot stranger in those early days. I'd encourage you to explore and read those texts very carefully.
Friends, we'll let that be our last question for the evening. I can see on Zoom that we still have many people with us. And so even though we can't see you and Dr. Patterson can't see you, will you at least join me in thanking our 2021 Grawemeyer winner, Dr. Stephen Patterson. So thank you for the lecture. And thank you all for being here tonight. And I hope you have a good evening.